समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या समझ में नहीं आया?
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
Welcome to the Worldview with Swasti. As you know that Afghanistan and Pakistan have been at war yet again. The latest round started on 26th of February and today we are, almost on the 4th or the 5th day of that war as well. Meanwhile, as you know that Iran and Israel have been at war too and United States has joined that theater. So of course there is a lot of violence happening in India's neighborhood and the extended neighborhood. And to make sense of the Pakistan-Afghanistan conundrum and why the Pakistan Taliban policy keeps backfiring and what really is the end game there, what is the position of the big powers out there, what is the position of China, what is the position of Turkey and Qatar and so on. And to understand that, to unpack a very complex situation today, I'm joined by Kamal Alam. Kamal Alam is a celebrated writer and a geopolitical analyst. He has been a fellow at RUSI, which stands for Royal United Services Institute in the UK. And then he's also been a fellow at the Atlantic Council. Today he joins me from London. He's also advising several governments on military strategies, and he's an expert on Pakistan, Afghanistan, and the larger Middle Eastern region. What makes his contribution really interesting is that he and his family have been involved in the back channel talks between Pakistan and Afghanistan. So very happy to have you, Kamal. Welcome to the Worldview.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, all right. So as you know that, let's just begin from what is happening. Like I said, that the latest rounds, of course, this keeps coming in several cycles. The last round happened in October 2025, and then the ceasefire was brokered by Turkey and Qatar. Then, the latest round started in February, on 26th February, and it's been about 4-5 days. And we also see that for a while, it sort of got a little clouded because of the larger war that sort of broke out in that neighborhood. But what is happening in the Afghanistan-Pakistan situation right now as we speak? And then, of course, we built on that.
I think this is not something that's just burst out all of a sudden. This has been a gradual decline between the relationship over the last 4 years. Of course, when Kabul fell in August 2021, there was euphoria in Islamabad, and the defense minister at the moment, Khwaja Asif, tweeted that finally things have worked out the way they have. And whether it was the military circles or the political civilian circles in Pakistan, they thought they've won the war rather than the Taliban. Of course, very, very rapidly, within a few weeks and months, Pakistan realized that the Taliban will not be able to be controlled, and the Taliban were their own. It was like Frankenstein. You might have created or curated it, but it's out of control. And as we speak now, there's been a complete breakdown of relationship, and probably the worst relationship between Kabul and Islamabad since the 1960s. The last time things were so bad where both sides were lobbing missiles at each other was during the 60s. So it's truly a remarkable breakdown whereby the Taliban do not want to be controlled by Pakistan, and Pakistan feel the Taliban are ungrateful for the decades of support that Pakistan gave them, only to be thrown back in their face.
Right. No, we are going to be talking a bit more about how Pakistan's Taliban policy has not worked, and you have done a lot of work on that. But before I come there, Kamal, please also tell me, because you're a military, strategist and a military sort of expert as well. When we look at the military capabilities, right? I mean, this has been going on, and from India's perspective, when we look at what Pakistan has been doing, of course, the both sides keep accusing each other. But of course, in India, we do see that Pakistan has gone all out and used a lot of conventional military force to kill women and children, and we keep seeing all of that. But just to sort of get a hang about the conventional military superiority that Pakistan definitely has as a as an air force, as a conventional military. But then Taliban also has not just the guerrilla warfare experience, but they also have the leftover American weapons and the smuggled Russian weapons. But is there anything more to it? I mean, it is not easy for Taliban to sort of take on a larger conventional military force such as Pakistan, isn't it?
Yes, and actually, in the conventional sense, the Afghan Taliban are no match for Pakistan. But as we saw, it was the same for NATO and the US military. The Taliban were not match for the US firepower, but over 20 years, Americans could not control much ground outside the cities. Of course, the difference here is Pakistan's not invading Afghanistan by land force. This is very much an aerial campaign. The Taliban can hit back with artillery. They've got American equipment, but that equipment cannot really penetrate beyond a few dozen kilometers, if that, in either Balochistan or Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. The Taliban do have some drone capabilities, but those drones so far have not really gone beyond Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. There are reports that one drone perhaps got all the way to Punjab, but there's no evidence of that. The main danger that Taliban pose is suicide bombers, and there are thousands of suicide bombers already in Pakistan that could be activated. And of course, it's the TTP, it's proxy war. The Pakistan Army have publicly said that the Afghan Taliban are not just supporting the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, but also the Baloch insurgency and Al-Qaeda affiliated and ISIS groups. So it's more the proxy support that Kabul can give rather than conventional threat to Pakistan. So Pakistan don't have a conventional threat, but fighting asymmetric warfare, the Americans failed against suicide bombers. It's very difficult to fight suicide bombers. That's Pakistan's greatest fear and obstacle.
Right, right. And I'm definitely going to come to these wonderful pieces that I just read that you wrote for the Rusi. And I'm really curious to understand what, in your opinion, is the biggest mistake on Pakistani side when it comes to their Taliban policy. But before that, since we are also talking in the larger context of a major war going on in the larger Middle Eastern region, which is, of course, I'm referring to Operation Epic Fury and Operation Roaring Lion. And you also hear a lot of discussion around how Pakistan has not been able to, I'm asking this question because there is a context here. Pakistan and Saudi Arabia signed a defense pact where Pakistan is supposed to sort of come to Saudi Arabia's rescue or give them a nuclear umbrella if their sovereignty or territory is threatened. And you do see that the Iranians did that. So first question to you about this particular connection is that how do you see that playing out? So please tell me that, and then I have a related question, but that will be later.
Sure, I think Pakistan has a very fine line in what it can do with regards to the Iranian attack on Saudi, and of course also the American attack on Iran. Because as you know, Pakistan at the moment is enjoying a particularly fancy honeymoon with Trump, where Trump is very close to the Pakistani military chief, Field Marshal Asim Munir, and also the Prime Minister. But of course, the Prime Minister in Pakistan is always irrelevant. So it's more about the generals in power. So Pakistan has to be very careful where, one, it doesn't criticize the American attack on Iran. Yet after the assassination of Iran's supreme leader, the Pakistanis have officially condemned and also paid condolences to the Iranians. They really cannot step in to support the Saudis because that would mean war against Iran. Here, we must say that Iran has publicly said they did not intend to attack the Saudi oil fields. So there is still a bit of fog of war as far as Iran's attack on Saudi goes. Iran's attack on the UAE and Qatar is deliberate. Iran's attack on Bahrain is deliberate. But I think Iran's attack on Saudi Arabia was either a miscalculation or a mistake because the Iranian military command have denied they targeted Saudi deliberately.
Right. That's a bit of a sort of reading between the lines because as far as I can see, I think the Iranians have sort of created an enemy out of everybody in the Gulf by literally targeting even Oman, that tried so hard to sort of play the mediator. But also there's a little bit of a thing that I want to understand from you on this question of Bagram, because there has been, at least in last year, there was this, discussion where Donald Trump wanted a Bagram base back and the the Taliban did not show any enthusiasm. In fact, and Pakistanis, just because they want to sort of play cozier to the American president, they have offered their own base, which is Swasti. I mean, how do you sort of make us understand here in India what is the best way to look at it?
I think if you remember last year, because in America, as you know, whenever there's any kind of foreign lobbying, you have to register the FARA. And part of Pakistan's proposal for a better relationship with the Americans was that the Pakistanis would help the Americans take Bagram back. So there's no secret. In the official relationship between Donald Trump and the Pakistani military, one of the bullet points was, we can help you with Bagram. Now, of course, that's easier said than done. But if you look at the current attack and the current relationship and the deterioration between Afghanistan and Pakistan, the Taliban and the Afghan governments are very clear that Pakistan is doing America's bidding. So if you look at the Twitter or social media war, the official Taliban spokesperson plus the Twitter accounts affiliated with Kabul are accusing Pakistan of doing America's war, which includes Bagram. Trump is very serious about Bagram. It wasn't just a throwaway statement. And although we've come to expect various statements from President Trump, I think one thing can be said. Whatever he says behind the scenes is always the same as what the real policy is. So there is an Afghan push. Pakistan is in no position to take Bagram. So potential of giving bases in Balochistan with the drones, whether it's in Pasni or some of the older bases just below Quetta. This is the old General Musharraf policy where Pakistan gave various drone bases to the Americans. They also gave a full F-16 airbase in Sindh, Jacobabad. So these things have been happening throughout Pakistan and America's history, all the way back to Peshawar and the U-2 flights. So Pakistan's always available in terms of giving their bases for Americans to use.
Right. And now, I have to ask you about this paper that you'd written for RUSI in 2024, where you'd argued that when it comes to Pakistan's biggest mistake and why its Taliban policy has been misfiring, right? It's because they were not working with Ahmad Shah Massoud. And I also read and I also went through, these interviews that you had done with Ahmad Shah Massoud's son. And as you know, I already mentioned in the beginning that you and your family have been involved in a lot of back channel talks. Help us understand a little bit about, of course, Ahmad Shah Massoud. He's a celebrated figure, but yes, also for the benefit of the Indian audience. And how do you sort of place this argument? Why do you think that this has been one of the biggest misses from Pakistan's side?
I think without doubt, the biggest strategic failure of Pakistan's Afghanistan policy since 1979 and certainly from the mid-1980s has been the alienation and lack of support to Ahmad Shah Massoud. It's no secret if you read the book Bear Trap, which was written by Brigadier Mohammed Yusuf, who was in charge of the Afghan directorate in the ISI. He clearly criticizes Ahmad Shah Massoud and said he was no friend of ours. So Pakistan have always supported the groups that have come to hurt it, starting from the groups in Afghanistan which turned against Pakistan, including Abdul Rasul Sayyaf, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who left Pakistan and went to Iran, then ironically came back to Pakistan, now lives in Kabul. Same thing with the Taliban. When the Taliban were born in the refugee camps and were launched in Kandahar, Ahmad Shah Massoud kept warning Pakistan, look, you think you might be supporting the Taliban, one day they will come to haunt you. And certainly Ahmad Shah Massoud's prophecies were fulfilled 2 decades as we speak now, that the Taliban have turned against Pakistan. Ahmad Shah Massoud warned them of this. There's another great book called To Allah's Mountains by Abdullah Anas and Tam Hussain, which looks at the Arab fighters in Afghanistan. And that says the
You've
same
also
thing.
mentioned to these. You've also referred to these books in your pieces, right? Because I'll be putting the link to your article in the description box for all the audience that might want to take a read of that. But yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
So unfortunately, Pakistan always backed the most radical factions in Afghanistan that turned to attack Pakistan itself. And so it's been a complete failure. Pakistan ignored the Tajiks, they ignored the Uzbeks, they ignored the Hazaras and the Turkmen. So basically, they had a Pashtun-centric policy. And the Pashtun-centric policy turned into a Taliban policy. And not only were they Pashtun-centric, they were actually against the non-Pashtuns, which actually make up the majority of Afghanistan. It's very interesting if you look at the narrative coming out of Pakistan now. For 30 years, Pakistan kept saying, and it's written in General Musharraf's memoirs, In the Line of Fire, that the Pashtuns are 60% of Afghanistan. Now the Pakistani spokesperson, General Ahmad Sharif, says Pashtuns are 42%, which of course is accurate. So for 30 years, Pakistan were fabricating facts. At least now under General Asim Munir, Pakistan is very clear that the Taliban policy is over. Does that mean there was 30 years of strategic failure? Does that mean there was a Frankenstein monster created that can no longer be controlled? And the whole good Taliban, bad Taliban policy. You know, Mike Pompeo wrote an article 2 days ago saying, we don't feel sorry for Pakistan because we warned them about this. Hillary Clinton said the same. And as far as me and my family, yes, I was part of, ever since I was a kid, going back to the 1990s, and then from 2008 onwards, directly being involved in talks between Ahmad Massoud, his family, and Pakistan. And at every moment, sadly, Pakistan kept going back to the Taliban and went back on their word in terms of supporting what they promised to not just the Tajiks, but also the Uzbeks. And here I'd also like to talk about Amrullah Saleh. Amrullah Saleh, who for many years Pakistan said was their enemy, but Amrullah Saleh was right about so many things, that you reap what you sow. So unfortunately, as we speak now, Pakistan has come to regret its 30-year policy. It's not going to be easy to break away from it because there are so many of these groups within Pakistan that are directly allied with the Afghan Taliban. But I think one of the breaths of fresh air is that Asim Munir, when he was DGMI and Director General in ISI, he was very clear that Pakistan needs to break away from the Taliban. So that could be, there's some lights at the end of the tunnel in how Munir rectifies this mistake and works with Ahmed Massoud and the NRF.
Right. But there's also some little, clarification that I'd like to from you, because as far as Shah Massoud is concerned, right, the Pakistanis always called him being pro-India, right? Musharraf also called him an enemy of the Pakhtuns. Then he also called them pro-America. And also the Arab countries called him pro-Iran. And then ultimately he was killed by Al-Qaeda. So, I mean, this is also, somebody whose identity is being weaponized by all these groups, help the audiences understand a little bit on how and where is this coming from.
Absolutely. I mean, this was false propaganda, and this is why I mentioned the book To the Mountains by Tam Hussein and Abdullah Anas. Abdullah Anas was the son-in-law of Abdullah Azzam, who was, of course, the leader of the Arab fighters, including the spiritual teacher of Osama bin Laden. Now, all the Arab Mujahideen came under Azzam. And Azzam very clearly in the book, along with Abdullah Anas, who's Algerian and the son-in-law of Azzam, said that once Azzam met Ahmad Shah Massoud, he was very clear that this was ISI propaganda. Massoud is not India's agent. Massoud is not Iran's agent. In fact, he's his own man. Massoud was the only Mujahideen commander who never left Afghanistan. He lived, fought, and was killed in Afghanistan till the last day, whilst all the so-called other Mujahideen were either in Peshawar or in Tehran or in Dubai. No one was in Afghanistan. Massoud lived, died in Afghanistan. So, and the Arabs found that a long time afterwards. And then, of course, bin Laden had Azzam killed. And then the rest is history, of course. 9/11 happened 2 days before that. Massoud is deliberately targeted by the terrorists, Al-Qaeda. So unfortunately, it's decades of policies, including the Americans here. We must say that if you read Peter Thompson, who was the American envoy to Afghanistan, he said that the CIA was against Massoud as well. So Massoud was no one's agent. I think Massoud was the only nationalist figure that said, I will talk to everyone, whether it's India, Pakistan, America, Iran, and the Russians. But at the end of the day, I will do what's best for the Afghans. The other Mujahideen leaders were all either working for the Pakistanis or the Iranians or the Arabs. They were not working for Afghanistan. And that's why to this day, none of them lived in Afghanistan. They all lived in neighboring countries.
Right. And since you're mentioning neighboring countries, Kamal, so I have to ask you about, also also the Taliban per se, because it's not just Pakistan that is, of course, Pakistan's ability to sort of punch above its weight and offer itself to United States and also be friendly to China at the same time. I think that is something which we probably will discuss a little later. But help me understand, even when it comes to Taliban, right? I mean, I also see a Taliban that is sort of playing all sides. So they have great investments from China. They also have, I mean, of course, right now things are quite up in the air with Iran, but then they have, I would say, great relations with Iran, with Turkey. So help me understand a little bit of how Taliban plays all sides, because from India's perspective, it is important for us to sort of also have this bit of discussion.
Yes, I mean, there's an old saying from the 1970s that you can rent an Afghan, but you can't buy an Afghan. And that probably suits, and now, of course, that's a racist and incorrect saying. But for the Taliban, certainly you've got your $10 a day Taliban, you've got your ideological Taliban, then you've got your $100 a day Taliban. The Taliban acts as a narco state. Now, whilst the official figures of opium production and drugs is down, they basically act as a mafia which can take money from any of the neighboring countries. So, yeah, right now one could argue that they're very close to Iran. In fact, I would go as far as to say that the Iranians replaced the ISI as the godfathers in charge of the Kandahar Shura. And this is not something that happened overnight. This is a gradual replacement that started in 2016-17, when NATO and the American military intelligence had clearly said that the Iranians are supplying weapons to the Taliban. Same with Russia. Of course, Russia being completely against the Taliban being against Russia throughout the 90s and the early 2000s, have now become the first country where Moscow recognizes the Taliban. But I think this is not an ideological relationship. This is a practical relationship. It's about money. We look at Central Asian states, Kazakhstan, they're doing a lot of business with the Taliban, Uzbekistan, and also the Chinese. But I think Chinese are loath to work with the Taliban ideologically. This is to protect China's own problem in Xinjiang, so the Taliban do not support the Uyghur fighters. So I think Taliban is open for business with anyone. They're more of a criminal mafia rather than, they use religion, but they are open to the highest bidders and organized crime. And here, in fact, I can tell you an interesting anecdote. Ahmed Massoud did his master's dissertation that to understand the Taliban, forget about Islam, forget about the Cold War, you've got to organize crime mafia syndicates. And that's how it started. This is also mentioned in Ahmed Rashid's great book, The Taliban. The first convoys that were leaving Quetta to go all the way to Ashgabat in Turkmenistan in the 90s, the Taliban said, we will give you full cover so the smuggling routes can be open from Pakistan all the way to Iran and Russia. So that's how they operate. First and foremost, they're businessmen.
Right. Also, help me understand a little bit about China here, because China has also been conducting the trilateral meetings between Pakistan, Afghanistan, and itself. And I think a certain set of those meetings have happened in Beijing. And of course, from India's perspective, we know that China plays this game there. And of course, that's another reason why India engages the Taliban, which is to sort of continue having the strategic depth on the one hand in Pakistan and on the other hand for Central Asia and so on. So help me understand. Do you think that China has limits when it comes to sort of containing this cycle and spiral of violence that keeps emanating between Pakistan and Afghanistan? Left to China, they would not want this ideally, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. I think China has its limits, and in fact, Chinese diplomats are very frustrated. They've tried a number of Afghan-Pakistan dialogue over the last couple of years, and it all resulted in failure. And in fact, China at the moment is more worried about Pakistan spiraling violence because Afghanistan is safer than Pakistan for China's investments. If you speak to most Chinese diplomats, they'll say Kabul is safer than Islamabad. Or when you look at the attacks in Balochistan or Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, certainly the Chinese engineers are safer in the north of Afghanistan. Having said that, Pakistan remains Pakistan's China's strategic ally, and there is no way China will ever abandon Pakistan. As a result, China will do all it can to protect Pakistan's national security. But I think push comes to shove, if the Taliban-Pakistan violence keeps flaring up, And I think, as the Pakistani defense minister recently said, this is an open war. We saw the Saudis tried it, the Qataris and the Turks have also hosted the Pakistan Taliban back channels. Nothing has happened. So I think the Chinese will begin to make calculations. And of course, with the ongoing war in Iran, we don't know how far this goes. Whatever happens in Iran will have a direct impact in Pakistan and Afghanistan. The Taliban have openly come out to support Iran publicly. This also is important in how Donald Trump sees the future of Bagram. And very clearly, he publicly supported Pakistan's offensive against the Taliban 2 days ago. So I think Pakistan is confident that it has Beijing's support and Washington's support against the Taliban should this go further.
Right, right. So then, Kamal, I mean, coming back to your hypothesis and this theory of how Pakistan has sort of made this mistake, which is obviously in your writings, you have, sort of argued and, about it. Do you see a change happening in Pakistan's strategy when it comes to engaging? I mean, the larger Afghanistan strategy, right? This is not just sort of the Taliban strategy, because the question of Durand line is still there. I mean, the Taliban government, not just the Taliban, successive Afghan governments have not recognized the Durand line, right? So where do you see this going? I mean, do we just keep seeing this cycle of violence coming back in spurts off and on? Or do you think that there is some coherent thinking in Pakistan about how to deal with it? Because as we can see, they are dealing with that. They are also dealing with Baloch separatism. So there's a hell lot of violence happening. It is also a very radicalized country right now. So yeah, help us understand.
It's a difficult situation because, as I said, to correct a 30-year mistake or a 40-year mistake, in fact, we're in the 44th decade of the Afghan-Pakistan violence since the Soviet invasion. The first fundamental decision needs to be made to cut off support to the ideological Islamic groups in Afghanistan, which at the moment, of course, represent in the face of the Taliban. If that's a clear decision, it's very clear Asim Munir, the chief of army staff, has made that very clear that the Taliban no longer has any friendships in Pakistan. The second thing they need to be very clear is, are they going to support Ahmed Massoud and the National Resistance Front? And of course, the other Afghan opposition groups, which includes Abdul Rashid Dostum. Then, of course, there's the former head of the Afghan National Army, Zia Yassin. And there's the two young Pashtun generals, Sami Sadat and Khushal Sadat. So Pakistan needs to make a fundamental shift in supporting those groups that represent the non-Taliban. Only then will we see some sort of correction in policy. The Baloch policy, of course, is completely separate to Afghanistan. I think that's more related to Iran. And as everyone knows, the Baloch insurgency has been on and off since the 1950s. It's not new. And this is something they need the support of the Gulf countries. And of course, with regard to the India-Pakistan conflict, whether the relationship with India and Pakistan improves, that could, I think, have a direct bearing in Balochistan. Right now, we're in the middle of, I think, the second Dhurandhar film coming out. That film, that ever since it came out, scandalized. Although it's officially banned in Pakistan, it's also the most watched film in Pakistan's history and the most downloaded film in Pakistan's history. And of course, that film touches on Balochistan. So it's
of course,
so
the tales of Layari. Yeah.
So
please go ahead.
So I think that the Baloch cycle of violence has a lot, and how that settles also has to do with the potential relationship between India and Pakistan. And at the moment, it doesn't seem like there is any progress in Delhi, Islamabad talks. But perhaps in all the violence that we see now with Iran, Kabul, and of course, we see a reversal of role if the Indians are getting closer to the Taliban. I think at the moment, it's a confused picture. But certainly, as you said, for Pakistan on the security front, last year was the worst year in over 10 years of terrorist attacks. They lost more than 5,000 soldiers and civilians. There was a 300% increase since the fall of Kabul. And of course, the past cannot be changed. One can only look to the future. And the only way Pakistan comes out on top here is if they completely abandon their Taliban past and start supporting the legitimate opposition groups of Afghanistan, of which there is NRF, ARF, and other groups based out of Uzbekistan and Turkey.
Kamal, I mean, you've been very kind with your elaborations here. Just help us understand a little bit. You mentioned the opposition factions in Afghanistan, right, which are non-Taliban groups, and you mentioned NRF, etc. What is the status of these groups? I mean, do they hold any political legitimacy vis-a-vis Taliban? I mean, my question to you then is, how do we make sense of opposition within Afghanistan vis-a-vis the Taliban?
I think as far as obviously geography and territory goes, without doubt, Taliban control 99% of Afghanistan, if not more. However, that does not mean that the Afghan opposition and resistance groups are not operating. Almost every week, there are half a dozen attacks against Taliban forces all over the country. Now, these are small attacks because the opposition groups are on their own. Not a single regional country or international country are supporting the NRF or the other resistance groups. So they're fighting a lone battle on their own. Very similar to the early 1980s. It took the Mujahideen more than 4 years to get where they were. The Americans didn't support them. Pakistan and Zia-ul-Haq didn't really support them because the Americans weren't putting that much money in. So it took a while. As far as legitimacy goes, without doubt, the Taliban are an ethno-nationalistic Islamic group which only represent Pashtuns, and that too, a particular kind of Pashtun. It's wrong to say all Pashtuns are Taliban. They're clearly not. So I think the Taliban legitimacy only comes from violence, and at the moment they have the monopoly on violence. And of course, if you control a state and you have monopoly on violence, you control the governments. So insofar as Taliban legitimacy, it only comes to the barrel of a gun, not by the support of the people. So I think the Afghan opposition groups at the moment are struggling militarily because they're on their own. But if you compare to where they are now compared to 3 years ago, they're already picking up the pace of attacks against the Taliban. And I think once regional countries or international countries support them, I think you'll see an uptake in terms of fighting the Taliban. And there are factions within the Taliban. We've seen Stanekzai, who ran away from Kabul because he was against the Taliban's policy on women's and girls' education. He was against their radicalization of all the schools and madrasas. So I think you can only rule by fear and by violence for only so long. The first Taliban government lasted perhaps 7 years. It's only been 4 years now. And given the events in Iran, and potential Pakistan changing its tune. If Pakistan changes its Afghan policy, the Afghan Taliban will fall pretty quickly. But it's too early to say for sure.
Okay. So I have to ask you a question, a sort of a corollary to that, of course, because I'm sitting in New Delhi and my government has a very good relationship with Taliban. So when you mention the opposition forces in Afghanistan, do they also then have an anti-India stance?
I don't think they have an anti-India stance at all.
So what is their geopolitical outlook? Because that makes it very interesting for us to study here then.
I think it's a cliche when they say that there are no friends in international security affairs. Of course, a lot of the Afghan opposition groups have family living in India to this day. They have personal links to Indian political leaders and security leaders I know personally. So it's not a personal thing. They understand at the moment India has no other option but to support the Taliban because the Taliban are there. And also, as again, an old cliche of my friend's enemy and my enemy's friends, if at the moment the Taliban are fighting Pakistan, it makes sense for India to support the Taliban. But I don't think India ideologically can ever be aligned with the Taliban, given Taliban, the way Taliban think. So I think the Afghan opposition groups are also very practical, and they will realize that a day will come when the Taliban will not be all powerful, and India will switch their support to the Afghan opposition groups, just like India supported the Afghan opposition groups before. And as I speak now, I know personally that India has strong links with many Afghan leaders on the personal level. So it's just a question of realpolitics and geopolitics. It's not ideological.
Right, the question of real politics and geopolitics. I like the way you summed it up, Kamal. And thank you so much for taking the time out. Of course, this is a question that we need to keep revisiting again and again because it's our immediate neighborhood. But thank you once again for taking the time out. I know you've just come back from work, and I'm very grateful that you agreed to speak to us.
No, thank you very much for having me on and look forward to talking to you again.
Sure. And you were watching Worldview with Swasti, so you stay tuned for yet another episode.